Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. This is a schmooze day, which means that I don't set an agenda, but I had invited five guests who had many things that were going to be sounded as if they'd be in common that we'd have to talk about. But two of them haven't shown up, and the other three don't know each other. So we're going to get acquainted, and we're going to get acquainted by talking about the state of the world initially. I mean, I normally don't pick a topic, but because we haven't had time to explore this, I want to just kind of narrow it down from the state of the universe to the state of the world, which should be give us scope for finding something that we want to discuss. Mostly, I need to be informed, and my guests can certainly bring me up to date about what's been going on in Europe, since it is now, I believe this is the NATO day when Biden is to meet his friends in Brussels. Anyway, let me introduce my guests. And here, first, I have Bruna Nota, who's an old friend from mostly Science for Peace days, when her husband was the treasurer of Science for Peace for a long time. But she is an activist living in a wonderful, classy home for retired people.
Hello, everybody, and good to be here.
Yeah. Robin Collins is in Ottawa. Robin is somebody I always turn to when I need something to be done because he's so willing, and he seems to have more time on his hands than most of us who have full-time jobs. I think I heard, Robin, that you do some kind of job that means you have to just be available at all times, but you really don't have much to do. Is that?
Thank goodness my boss isn't listening in on this conversation. No, I have a full-time job too, but
I know, but you managed to squeeze in everything that anybody asks you to do on top of your full-time job. And then I see images of you out in a canoe someplace. So I think life can't be too hard on you. Anyway, Robin Collins is in Ottawa. Now, Joy, probably anybody who grew up in Canada in the last, 20 years ago, would have read your book, Obasan, because I think all the high school kids were pretty much expected to read Obasan in those days. So hello, Joy, how are you?
Okay, I just put these earpods on so I can hear much better now. I'm deaf.
Good. Okay, well, we all need those. Actually, I have some, but I don't ever use them. I was about to introduce you as a novelist and a poet and a very good friend. And Adam Wynn here is my right hand. He absolutely he's indispensable. And I'm just immensely grateful for all the help that he gives me every day and every night. I mean, until midnight, I'd be calling this guy, asking for, well, now, how do I turn on this app on my computer? And he always pitches in and tells me what to do. So thank you so much, Adam. I can't give you enough appreciation. Let's get down to work, shall we? We're starting a little late. And I'm going to ask Robin, since he always follows things, controversies and disputes with enthusiasm. I mean, Robin is somebody that I have more arguments with than anybody else. And we always sort of wind up as friends, with a lot of caveats, but we managed to come out all right. Now, I haven't been following what's been going on in Europe, but Robin, can you kind of brief me on what is expected of this meeting in Brussels? And I believe immediately afterward or shortly thereafter, Biden will go on to Geneva for a conference with Putin. And that, to me, is always the most exciting thing to watch. What has happened so far? And you've been reading all these emails that have been flitting through my inbox, and I haven't been reading many of them, but I understand there's some controversy among peace activists about what position we should be taking on some issue regarding the Brussels meeting?
So I can only give you a kind of a superficial look at what I've been keeping an eye on. You know, you're right. There's like three things happening at the same time. One is the G7 meeting had just taken place. Then there's the NATO meeting, and then there's the meeting between Biden and Putin. All of which are interesting. Let me just throw one quick one on the G7. The most interesting thing I heard to be followed up on is there was an agreement by the G7 leaders to look at a global minimum tax, which is, you know, fits into some of your Save the World platform functions. That is, you know, a Tobin tax or something else, right? So, you know, I mean, the cynic in me says the reason why they're doing this is because there's a number of non-G7 states that are benefiting by having their countries become tax havens. And now the G7 leaders are worried that the taxation is fleeing the big boys and going to the smaller states. Anyway, it's a legitimate concern. And whether they'll get a handle on this, we'll see. But the fact that they actually came with an agreed statement on it is fascinating, possibly progress.
Okay, now maybe my impression is wrong. I thought they were talking about a corporate tax. Are they also talking about personal taxes?
No, it's corporate. But I mean, from what I understand, it's corporate tax. And but this is the Tobin tax was really about speculation on currencies, but this is all the corporate world. So, you know, companies like I'm going to pick Apple out of the air, even if I don't know whether they play this game, but you know, they've got some hidden office on the third floor of a building in Ireland somewhere, or some island where somebody sits.
Ireland is good though, aren't they?
No,
I mean, Ireland, actually, I think they do have an office in Ireland. It's a big one, but I don't think I
picked the wrong country. Anyway, it was in Ireland, I'm pretty sure. And so anyway, and there's somebody sort of mysterious at the top of the stairs that who runs this flow through so that taxes aren't paid in the home countries.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, if that's what this is dealing with, that's, I think, a very good thing, because it really is looking at global taxation, connecting the dots here corporately, at least, and some of the big guns being involved in that process. So that's probably a good thing. So anyway, that's the only thing I know about the G7. The NATO, I don't know what the general conversation is, but from our point of view, the getting NATO members and also Putin and Biden to talk about no first use for nuclear weapons. This new global campaign for no first use has now issued a letter to Biden and Putin with 1,100 signatures of some very well-known people and a number of organizations, some military folks trying to step up the game on no first use. This could be, I mean, there's two things on no first use to remember. One is this isn't a call for second use. It's to make the world safer.
Let's hope not.
By removing that, sort of knee-jerk, let's send a nuclear weapon no matter what, and also by reducing that risk. And secondly, a step towards abolition, because if nobody has first use as part of their platform, then what are those weapons for? So
now I'm a little embarrassed because I wrote a piece about no first use for the current issue of the magazine. That is the current forthcoming issue, which we're going to go to press in 2 or 3 days. And I did not put anything in there because I haven't been following it. I didn't mention that there was a plan to put it to them to discuss at the meeting. So I don't know, maybe I can find a way to squeeze in another couple of words and say that this is going to be discussed, but it will have already happened by the time we go to press. So that's important to know that do you think they are actually going to discuss this, or have they said they're going to discuss it, or is it that our friends are trying to get them to discuss it?
Well, the reason why there's some enthusiasm is because Biden in 2017, when Obama Biden stepped out, and Trump came in, he made a declaration, no first use or sole purpose, in which he said it was ridiculous for the U.S. to even have this as part of their program, as a policy. So Biden is on record only 4 years ago as saying he was against no first use. Now, that was 4 years ago. That's the only problem. So this new campaign is kind of using that opportunity, and also, it's a bit of a reflection on the Reagan-Gorbachev meeting summit, in Iceland in the 80s, and that's not mentioned in the letter, but that's sort of in the back of people's minds. If Biden and Putin sit down, might magical things happen. I mean, these aren't the late 80s, but you never know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's certainly a hopeful thought. I know that Bruna, you are very engaged with working on Indigenous people's rights, and I imagine that part of some of the groups you've been with are in a state of agitation about this discovery about Kamloops. Can you? Of course, this show is going out to the whole world, and there are people in other countries who will not know about that. So maybe you can tell us what has been discovered recently about graves of children from residential schools, because it is right now a very important issue in Canada, and probably should have been all along.
Well, the discovery is really, really the tip of the iceberg, an enormously shameful iceberg in the history of Canada, that we have entered into people's land under false pretenses, having treaties which we never had intention to honor from the beginning, because we have used language that would never have been accepted had the counterpart have understood it. The language was English, and their language were different ones. But even on what has been reported and what is written, we have never honored any of those treaties, and we continue to do so. And I just wrote a letter this morning to Caroline Bennett, who is the Minister for Nation-to-Nation Relations, and who is also my MP in the area, following the article that Cindy Blackstock has just written in the policy options about the continuing Canadian taking Indigenous people to court, even though there are, I think, some 19 injunctions, or I don't know the right terms, but the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has time and again asked, dictated, directed the government to make amends, to pay, to retrieve. And Canada instead has gone back, and it is forever rejecting those claims. And as we speak, there is a tribunal in which Canada is contesting two of the latest Canadian Human Rights Tribunal condemnations or requests or demands of what it should do. So the 215 children discovered, I don't call it a mass grave, because a mass grave is some kind of, it is a pit in which children from the residential schools have been dumped as they died of malnutrition, infirmity, whatever, maltreatment. And Dr. Bryce, at the beginning of the 19th century, who was asked by the government to do an inquiry of the indigenous people situation and the residential school, gave a scathing report saying, you are killing the people. And he was promptly fired. And that report has not been acted upon, and we are still not acting. So when we are talking about economic dealings with the world, we are talking about environmental, we are talking about disarmament, we are talking about, and at the same, we are supposedly being a very good and proactive and innovative countries, but we are continuing to extract enormous richness from forestry, from mines, from uranium, from whatever, from the country, without any adequate or any compensation to speak of to the rightful owners of all of this. So anyway, sorry, I am vehement. I am, I am really exercised about that. And I started saying that this morning I wrote a letter sending the reference to the policy option article of Cindy Blackstock to Mrs. Bennett, saying the reason listed in this article are the reasons why I have stopped writing to you for the last 15, 20 months, because Ursula Franklin, you all know Ursula Franklin?
Everybody knows her. I knew her, yes.
She used to say, when I was saying, well, but we have to tell them, said, it is not a lack of knowledge. It is lack of integrity and lack of will.
Okay, now you said some very provocative things. I don't know whether everybody agrees with you. We have certainly not discussed this. I haven't had a conversation with anybody on this topic, as a matter of fact. But I want to encourage everybody to feel free to take issue with, or to agree with, or to chime in and add your thoughts on this subject.
I think it is the way we value people that we know and do not value people we do not know, that somehow some people are more human than others in our way of seeing each other. And so if we want a world in which more people are valued, we have to do something about knowing who they are. And we have an us and them world. And I think our job is somehow to get the stories of people so that we can see that everybody is, especially the ones we do not see. There are huge categories of people that we do not consider to be as human as those with whom we are familiar. Mm-hmm. So the more hidden, the more unfamiliar anybody is, the more we owe it to our common humanity to get to see what is not seen.
Well, okay, but let me just explore an alternative question. Did people who set up these residential schools know what they were doing or intend it to be the way it was? We're finding, and for the last several years, it's been a recognized truth in Canada that the residential schools were disastrous for children, for their families, and for the Indigenous communities from which they came. That these were just an unmitigated horror. I wonder, because what happened was that children were forcibly removed from their families and put into these schools and told that they must speak, I guess, English or French, but not their first language. And many other things obviously happened: brutality, sexual abuse, malnutrition, inadequate medical care. So that when we see now that an extraordinary number of children died, who presumably, I assume it was a higher death rate than one would normally expect in a school. 200 some odd students. I don't know any schools around Toronto that have a graveyard with 200 bodies in it. So it seems to have been an exceptional death rate. Who started this with what intentions? I know that Ryerson, the Egerton, is that how you pronounce his name? Egerton Ryerson, was the sort of the inspiration or founder of Ryerson, what is now Ryerson University, and they're thinking of changing the name because they're so ashamed of the connection with this man who by now has lost all the luster from his reputation that had been assumed to belong to him 30 years ago. So he's now being accused of or blamed for this the development of the residential schools, and probably a lot of other people were too. Question is, in my mind, did people actually, were they motivated to be brutal? Did they set this out as a penal colony or something? Why would anybody have created an institution as grim as we're now being told the residential schools were?
I want to talk to that, please, because I was having a conversation yesterday with David, my ex-husband, who had been hired by Indian Affairs to close down the residential schools. And he said that initially they were wanted by the Native people themselves because they needed to have the children stay safely in a place while they went off to do their hunting. And so that was the initial reason for their creation. So it wasn't an evil intent at all. It was the responsible effort to respond to the needs that were presented for the safety of the children and for a place for them to stay while they went hunting. And so as his job was to close them down, and he met a lot of resistance from the Native people themselves, from the churches who had by now come into them and were running them. And he said that the people who were chosen to run those schools were not people of empathy. And so that he felt that the abuse came as a consequence of the types of people that were chosen to go in and run those schools.
Why would they have chosen? Who chose them? And did they know what they were doing? Did they pick people who were sadistic? Or did they not?
I don't think so. I think a lot of people that were inclined to be abusive of children would have found this to be a wonderful opportunity for them to do exactly as they wished. And so that this was a that some particularly bad people went there because of the freedom with which they could continue to do bad things. And but David said that when he went in there to close these things down, he came from a social work background, and he knew that institutionalizing children was definitely wrong, that children belonged with their parents. So the first rule he made was that anybody that could be with their parents needed to be with their parents. And that automatically closed down a lot of the institutions because children could be with their parents. And the schools could be brought to them instead of them having to go to schools. I wish David were here right now. He'd have a great deal to say on this very topic. David Kugawa, he's 91 years old now, but his mind is still there and he remembers all these things because this was his job.
Okay.
I have a similar perspective as that Joy just offered. I should say that I haven't looked deeply into this. I mean, I think most of us haven't looked deeply. Many of us haven't looked deeply into it. For some of us, it is new information. I was never aware growing up that there were such things as residential schools, and neither did I know what the original purposes of them there were. There was an interesting article in the Globe on Saturday by Erna Paris, who wrote to this topic as well, and she said, you know, she was brought up, she was born and brought up in Canada, and she didn't know until, you know, into her 20s or later that there were such things as residential schools. Now they've been around since the late 1800s. The
earliest were in the 17th century in the French territories.
Okay. So the ones that, so let's take the Egerton-Ryerson argument. I think there's a little bit that more depth has to go into assessing his role. I've read, and here I say, this is where I admit my superficiality. I've read one article about him, and it was noted that, first of all, the residential schools of dispute started up. So this, Adam, so I don't, these would be after the ones you're talking about, but the more recent ones, they started up like 2 or 3 years after he had died. So let's say for the sake of argument, he was an inspiration. What this article had said was what he had wanted were agricultural schools to sort of head off the assimilation risks for indigenous populations that he saw might take place with industrialization. And so this was kind of a different style of residential school that would you know, help protect their culture. So there's no question that there's an assimilationist aspect to some of those advocating residential schools. He doesn't seem to have been one of them. And in fact, the article pointed out that the large majority of Indigenous people, I believe, leaders, at least in Ontario, I believe, were in support of these schools that he was advocating. So I'm not defending residential schools. You know, these were not run by the churches, for one thing. There's an ideological aspect to the church-run ones for sure, and that might be in part what Joy was referencing as to, you know, the personalities. You know, they had a mission, they had, you know, something they wanted to instill. They wanted to, you know, move the barbarians away from their culture and into the enlightenment of, you know.
I'm sorry, but can I interrupt? Because how many of these schools were run by churches, and were there also ones that were run by the government or some non-partisan, non-ideological institution?
From what I understand, and these are not the Egerton agricultural ones, so I don't know what percentage those were, but from what I understand, the majority were run by the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches. And there was a transition moment when they decided this is the best way to do it. I don't know enough about the history about that. I do know that
they were authorized by the government. Generally, it was authorized by the government that the churches would run the schools in many of the communities.
Do you know the date? You know when that happened, Adam? You don't have a date on that, eh?
So there were early residential schools that were run by the French and, from my understanding, mostly Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century. And then there is a real resurgence and real push for the expansion of the residential school system in the 19th century. And that even occurred in the mid-19th century. We saw pushes by, for example, Peregrine Maitland, who was an administrator, proposing in 1820 to remove Indigenous children from their families and communities for schooling. And then we saw the Davin Report during the Sir John A. Macdonald administration, where Nicholas Flood Davin was sent to the United States to create, it was essentially a one-man, 2.5-month commission on how Canada could model its residential school system after the industrial school system in the United States. As to when it became standard practice for the churches to run the residential school, I don't have a specific date for that, but we certainly have seen it throughout history, as I mentioned, in the 17th century and again in the 18th century.
I'm sorry, 17th century would be the 1600s.
1600s was when the
The 1700s is what you're talking about, right?
No, I'm talking about 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and
In the 1600s.
yes,
So you really mean the 17th century?
yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you were misspeaking.
No, I am referring to the 1600s of when the earliest schools in the North American context emerged, and those were run by missionaries in what were, from my understanding, largely the French-controlled territories.
Wow, I didn't know that they were doing things like that so early. I wasn't brought up in Canada, so my history of Canada is very wobbly. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go on. This is interesting.
If you go to there's a website, I don't know, government website, where were the residential schools? There's a map, you type in where you are and you see the residential schools that are generally being discussed. These are not the ones I think Adam's referring to, the very early ones. So
Are you looking at such a thing on your screen right now?
No, I don't have it.
Oh, okay. Because I was thinking you could do a screen share and have a look.
Yeah. So I looked up, okay, so where's the nearest one to Ottawa? And it was like 140 kilometers, like near the Montreal, near the Quebec, Ontario border toward, Cornwall, Montreal. That was the closest one, which explains why I didn't know they existed, growing up.
So when were they really closed down? Or I suppose it was a gradual thing. Joy, when was David doing his thing?
That would have been in the 60s, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Oh my word! Look at those, all the way up to in the Arctic, and have a pointer. Point to them and tell us what we're seeing.
So the red dots are residential schools, but there is a specific note here. This data is from the National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, and it only includes schools listed in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. So there were schools outside of these ones, but this does show a general overview of where some of the schools were located. And this is directly from the National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation. So
what's that one up the top? Look how close, that's in the Arctic. Way up.
Yeah.
What is that called?
That's Pond Inlet. It opened in 1962. Mitimatatlik is, and my apologies if I'm saying that name incorrectly. We also saw during the Cold War, there was the forced relocation of Inuit people in northern Canada. So you can see here, there's a large archipelago of islands in the north. But during the Cold War period, the Canadian government forcefully relocated Inuit families from Nunavik, which is northern Quebec, and some of the more southern Arctic islands, and forcefully relocated them further north to serve as what they considered human flagpoles for claiming the territory that the Canadian government could use during the Cold War. And this had a huge, huge, huge impact on the Inuit because they had no say in the relocation, the forced relocation. Completely changed the territory that they were familiar with for hunting and other lifestyle elements. And it was huge, and they didn't get an apology until the 2010s or 2000s or 2010s.
Yeah, I when I was a kid, I read Farley Mowatt's books, People of the Deer. I forget the second one, but there were at least two that were about some of the relocation events that took place. I remember I actually sent him a letter I don't know, I was about 15 or 14 or something, and saying, and my question was, what should we do about it? And he was writing about the 1950s, I think. I think that was the period that he was writing. And anyway, just
Well, there may have been things that did need to still be done about it, but
Yeah.
I didn't know either. I mean, I came to Canada in 1971, so I can sort of be excused for not knowing as much as people who grew up here. But I just heard about it as something that, in fact, I think the first time I heard about it as a controversy was, I believe, Pierre Trudeau had a position not necessarily in favor of residential schools, but generally of assimilation, and I think he had to recant.
yeah, he backed out. He backed off a bit.
What do you remember about that? Because it was something I heard. It went through one ear and out the other. What was his position? What was the debate about?
He wanted to close Indian affairs, I believe, and there was a response to it from Indigenous people, in part because there was a fear that certain protections, what they might have been, would be lost, and so I think that was part of it. And there was also an uncertainty as to, so if you end Indian affairs right now, what do you do to replace it right now, so that you don't leave people hanging on a limb, And so it's a very complicated question, really. And I think I don't know that his intention was assimilation per se. I really don't know an answer to that. It was more dependence on government, and and Indigenous people want to be independent. So let's do it. Let's make that step. Let's take the step. But I don't know that it was that well thought out.
There is record that the official policy was to eliminate, to destroy, the whole indigenous problem, and similar to the Nazi final solution type of thing. And that is where John A. Macdonald is being faulted, and some of the words pronounced at that time, influenced enormously the whole system. Now we're talking about knowing, Joy, and Professor Peter Russos, who was professor of constitutional affair at U of T, and he had a revelation about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when through a number of circumstances, he realized that he didn't know anything about the history of the indigenous people. And he wrote a new book, essentially taking away from what he had written prior to that for his courses. And his new book is, I'm going to put a few references on an email to you, Meta, after this meeting. I am not good enough to do many things at once. But so the ignorance, the not knowing, has been a very strongly embedded in the system. But now the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the inquiry on missing and murdered women, and the commission that was prior to that, was it in the 80s or 90s? I don't remember which date. That
Child welfare, 1983 one.
that had a roadmap, a 20 years roadmap on how things could be done right with the indigenous people. I don't remember at what date.
Adam, is that the right one?
I'm not sure if that's the same report, but there is also the term 60 scoop that was coined in the 1980s when they did the mass forced removals of children from their communities and put them up for adoption in white families, which is now a class action lawsuit. But I think Bruna is referring to a different report than that one.
So if we go through, for instance, the latest book, or not the latest, but this conversion book from Peter Russell gives a very good chronology of the treaties and what has happened, that gives that chronology of how Canada became a country and how within that country, the whole Indigenous chapter had been expunged. And so, yes, there is a lot of writing. There is a lot of conferences. There are lots of things that are happening, and we may not be clued into what is, but
well, I wonder, how much assimilation actually took place.
how much? Sorry.
How much assimilation actually took place, and where it took place. Was it through such things as residential schools or depriving people of certain rights, or was it the way normally immigrants to Canada assimilate? Just by moving to the city and taking up jobs with other people and marrying people not of their own background and so on. To what extent would the population of Canada differ if people who are part Indigenous by genetics had maintained their cultural and tribal identities, as opposed to the way it is now, where presumably some fraction of them became, I don't know whether you want to count the Métis in particular, or people who simply, migrated into regular mainstream Canadian society, but who became assimilated. Does anybody have a sense of how much assimilation actually has happened?
I think the premise of assimilation is kind of, this is their country. And at the beginning, because of their culture, they were welcoming new people, and that's why the arrivals of the people with first contact survived the scurvy, survived winters, because Indigenous people taught them how to live in this climate and under these conditions. And then when the numbers became much larger, that is when the supremacy, I don't think there is a better word, of the new commerce of the, because they were large enough. We settlers were in large enough numbers that we then wanted their land. We pushed them away into the reserves, into non-survivable situation.
Well, I think that's clear, Bruna, but what I'm saying is some proportion of those people intermarried with us settlers, if you will.
Yeah.
And I want to know, and they no longer think of themselves as Indigenous. I mean, the descendants
yes, they are.
no longer do. They're part of, Now, for example, I'm not Canadian by birth. I am Choctaw Indian. But I don't know anything about Choctaw Society. I was born in Oklahoma, which was an Indian territory, and my father was born while it was still Indian territory. And when I was in the first grade, the teacher said, "How many of you kids are part Indian?" And I put my hand up, and 2/3 of the class did, or half, or I don't know. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought the world consisted of people who were part Indian. And it wasn't a shame, it wasn't a pride, it wasn't anything. Didn't mean anything except, one of my ancestors had been Indian and one was Choctaw. And I believe my brother says that on the other side of the family, the other grandmother was part Cherokee. Well, I hadn't heard that. Okay. So I didn't know. And I'll tell you the story. About 15 years ago, I was in the beauty parlor getting my hair done, and the woman beside me, there was a big glass mirror. We were looking at the mirror, and she was seeing me, and she said, "I think you're part Choctaw." And here it was in Toronto. And how in the world did you know that? She said, "Well, it's something about your eyes."
Oh,
She had lived among Choctaw people. So I came home and I started looking up all the pictures of Choctaw people I could see if there's anything distinctive about our eyes. No, I didn't see anything. And then I thought, I'm going to be on the lookout for people whose eyes look like mine. Okay, about 6 or 8 months later, I was looking at Bill Moyers on TV, and I thought, his eyes look sort of like mine. I'm going to look him up. And I started to find out what happened. Where did he come from? Well, he came from a reservation in Oklahoma, an Indian reservation, and I think Hugo, Oklahoma. Well, I wrote a letter to say, "Are you part Indian?" I never got an answer, so I don't know.
oh.
But I thought, well, now where are these reservations? I never heard of a reservation in Oklahoma. Well, yes. As a matter of fact, my town was smack dab in the very middle of the Choctaw Indian Reservation, and I never knew it. There wasn't any demarcation. There wasn't anything on the map saying this is a reservation. There was nothing. But, here, all of these kids in my class and I have been, my grandmother was part Choctaw. Maybe both of my grandmothers were part Indian. Well, so about 3 or 4 years ago, my brother and I took a trip back to our hometown. I wanted to see the place before I died. And so we get there, and now there's a big casino saying about right almost in the town where we live, little town called Calera. Big casino. It's owned by the Indians. It's a Choctaw casino. And you see signs saying you're in Indian, you're in Choctaw Reservation. There was never anything saying that before. And we went to my mother's high school, which she had gone to because she was part Indian, and there was a school for Indian girls. And she had apparently gone to this high school. It is now the center of the Choctaw Nation. It's a big building with, computers and photos of the old chiefs on the walls. And my brother went off to talk to the guy about, trying to find our lineage, who was our relative and how was he Choctaw and so on. But I was looking at the pictures, and by golly, these people on the hallway, they have eyes that look like mine. So here I am. I'm an assimilated Indian descendant who wouldn't have known it. It was the most peripheral part of my identity. In no sense did I ever think of myself as Choctaw, and I know nothing about the society or their culture, but now they're back into talking about it and promoting their culture. And I really ought to read a book or two about Choctaw culture or history or something. Okay. Sorry.
Can I throw in a loop here?
Yeah.
I think most people around North America believe there were injustices and attempts at assimilation that were unjust. There were treaties that were not abided by, and that continues. And these things need to be fixed or solved in one way or another in a just and equitable way. I'm looking down the road somewhat, and for instance, let me take the term settler that was used here. I find the term somewhat disconcerting. The implication of the word settler is that there are people who came here early and people who came here late, and the ones that came here early are non-settlers, and the ones who came here later were settlers. That is, there's an us and them. I don't think that garners well for the future of people living together. I don't know any indigenous people, although I have heard there are some, who argue that those who came from Europe should go back to Europe any more than most people say that people who are Black should go back to Africa. People don't say that except unless they're, racist on the right, neo-Nazis. So what we need to look at down the road is how we are going to live together in respect of each other's background, whether you came here 40,000 years ago, actually not you, your ancestors came here 40,000 years ago, or they came here, 500 years ago, or 10 years ago, or just arrived. We have to decide whether the form of country we are going to have is going to be based on ethnic nationalism, or it's going to be based on constitutional and civic nationalism. These are the two major divides in democracies. The bigger world is, cosmopolitan, and we talk about internationalism, we talk about the human race. We have to get to that place and away from the crimes of the past. The crimes have to be addressed. There's no question about that. They have to be addressed. Money has to change hands, land has to be fixed, but we have to settle here together in a way that we are not at each other's throats and doing DNA analysis to find out what percentage of what we are or were. That's not going to get us where we need to be.
Okay, I'm sympathetic to that, but it's not my show. In the sense that I want to turn to Joy about that, because I know this is relevant to Joy's own personal history, although she's certainly not Indigenous Canadian. But Joy is from Japanese ancestry and Japanese Canadian culture, and was brought up not in a residential school, but in something much worse in some ways, because you were moved to a relocation center during World War II, where you had to live under difficult situation. Joy, I think you and I actually do take different positions about this. I'm much more compatible with and comfortable with an assimilationist position than I think you are. And I think you once called me a racist.
I can't remember saying that. And I don't know I don't remember the context of such a statement, but anyway.
I want you to talk about this question of assimilation, because I think that you are opposed to the assimilation of immigrants, such as the Japanese Canadians.
Well, what I'm opposed to is one group forcing another group to do its will. I think that we should have the right to self-determination, that we should all respect each other, I kind of think. But so I'm not, I don't remember whatever it was.
Oh, well, I don't know that it's worth my reminding you. There were immigrants coming from the Tamil group, and I was worried that the identity of the Tamil population was going to be consolidated, and I was of the opinion that it would be good to encourage people when they come to settle in other parts of Canada and not to form India Town or Chinatown or Tamil Town or clusters of networks that are totally self-contained, but rather I was in favor of encouraging a more assimilationist set of policies, and you felt that was that I was really discriminating against any number of immigrants who might want to come and settle as in clusters.
I think people have a right to be with their friends. And if you come with a bunch of people that you feel comfortable with, I don't see anything wrong with them being together. And automatically, as time goes by, their kids are going to mix up with a whole bunch of other kids. It's that kind of country. And so we don't need to force them to go and be miserable and isolated away from their friends just for some ideological reason. I think that you leave people alone, and the boundaries expand because their kids are curious about other things. So yeah, I'm not one for legislating a lot of things. I think things move on.
Okay.
It can be an organic process. I mean,
yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Maybe we're all winding up on the same side. I don't know. Bruna?
I think it's good to legislate certain kinds of things so that power doesn't remain within this select group. It's not just the Scots, that become the real Canadians and at the top and club. I think it's a good to.
All right. Well, we've had a conversation, and it's not anything that I would have anticipated at all. But I've enjoyed it. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you
you.
for this opportunity. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Robin.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.